Hi, I'm Noam Wasserman, Dean of the SciSim School of Business at Yeshiva University. I was a longtime professor at Harvard Business School, an entrepreneur, and a venture capitalist. I wrote the bestseller, The Founder's Dilemmas.
And I'm Charlie Harari. I've been working with companies for over 10 years. And that book, The Founder's Dilemmas, and the challenges faced by the 10,000 founders in it is the basis of this podcast. We are delving into the issues faced by startups to help you avoid the pitfalls that claim so many good companies.
Let's get started.
Welcome to Founders Dilemmas podcast. I'm Charlie Harari here with Dean Wasserman. Got an incredible guest. Dean, kick us off. What do we got?
Hey, thank you, Charlie. Great to be back with you and back with Yonit Serkin, who until recently was the powerhouse director of the largest startup incubator in Israel, the MassChallenge-Israel Incubator. We've gone through a bunch of things in terms of the making of Yonit, the making of MassChallenge-Israel. And we also got into how they select the startups to become part of the incubator there. Now we want to get into the development side. There's both selection and development that goes into this. Yonit, if you can talk to us a little bit about the key developmental steps during the MassChallenge Incubator program. What have you seen are the key inflection points where a startup really starts being able to absorb what the developmental pieces are and act on them, and where it really changes their trajectory?
It's a great question. I think that for what we were trying to do in Israel, and we would keep doing so many things before sort of the launch of the accelerator so that they could really, we wanted to see how could we make sure that people were hitting the ground running, because once you start, there's this time clock, right? You only have 4 months. You only have so much time. And how can you be as ready as possible beforehand so that you can really take advantage of all those opportunities so that you know what you're looking for? It's sort of like at the first semester of college, sort of how do you figure out what it is that you need to take? What are the things that you need to do? What are the things that you want to do? And so our team used to meet with the entrepreneurs literally one-on-one, understand where they were, what their challenges are, and really try to map out for each one of them some highlights that they would want to take advantage of. I think when you boil down what, to my experience at MassChallenge, was what we were trying to do for the entrepreneurs. Number one, it was know yourself, where you're at in your process. Are you early on in this stage? Have you figured out, do you have the problem that you understand, but you still need to deep dive into the industry or into the sector more? Are you at a point where you already are having those conversations and maybe you need to have them on a global level where you've been having them on a more local level? That's something that's somewhat more unique for Israel, I think, because we're such a small market that pretty quickly on, we have entrepreneurs who need to start talking to international entities to get a sense of how things are working in other countries. So a lot of time spent on that. And then ultimately it was really active mapping out. How do you figure out who are the people that you need to connect with? Who are your door openers? Who are your consults? Not as like consultants that you're bringing on, but rather whose feedback do you want to get early on? Whose advice do you want to hear at least so that you can move forward? And literally our team would sit with the entrepreneurs and go through sort of who's in the universe that is connected to MassChallenge, who's part of the network, who's essentially waiting and willing to pick up the phone when you call them, which is, I think, the greatest gift that one gets when you're part of these accelerators or programs. But the other thing is that it doesn't end there. We instituted 2 things that I think were really meaningful. Number one, MassChallenge-Israel was the first to create a roadshow to the US, again, recognizing that so many Israeli startups and global startups, really, not just Israeli, because about a third of the companies that were accelerated in Israel are not Israeli, were not domiciled in Israel. So many of them are trying to understand markets outside of Israel. They're trying to understand the US market primarily. So let's bring some of them out there. Let's connect them on the ground and prepare them for that. And so that was a huge, important component of what it is that the value that we were bringing to entrepreneurs. It was that we're bringing you to the US, we're introducing you to the relevant stakeholders. And then the second piece was recognizing that the post-accelerator period was probably more important even than the accelerator period. If you think about it, that you're spending all this time learning, you're spending a lot of time sort of studying, but then at some point you have to synthesize that and actually make it part of your process. And where you are on your first day after the accelerator is done isn't the end. That's, for many of them, that's the beginning. You're now launching all these processes, you're launching a new, essentially a new company. And that the network and the community that's created through, whether it's MassChallenge or any other accelerator incubator, is actually all the more powerful the further you go, the longer it goes. And it doesn't end on that last day of the accelerator. It sort of starts then. So I really, we spend a lot of time sort of building out the alumni group, much more meaningful connections with the companies as they were getting bigger, because that's where we could actually continue to be impactful and really actualize some of the things that we had been spending all this time talking about, and now actually could see it.
Can I ask you to double down on something? I think a major issue that people have is the translation between idea and action, right? Bringing down the Torah from Har Sinai down to the ground. And it's great when you go to the accelerators and you go to the classes and you hear the podcasts and you get it. It makes sense. Of course, we're doing it. It's amazing. We're going. And then like life comes back and you're sitting in your office and you're distracted and you watch the Knick game, or you did the thing and it didn't work out, or the Excel spread. So how do you help these founders really translate day one? Like, we have a term here in our company called day two. Day one, everything's amazing, and the orientation, and it's we came from and we're going to, and then like day two, you get there, you come at your desk and you're like, okay, like how do I
now
okay,
what?
So we
Now
have
what
a
do I
whole
do?
program called day two, and like in our world, day two is like code for everything else that you have to do.
I love that. I think
what,
it's really clever.
right.
The good system to institute. And it's a great question. And it's not just day two, it's 3, 4, it's
Right.
I think the first thing is that, at least in Israel, founders are comfortable with the idea that everything's going to change, right? You're pivoting constantly. And you are where you are, you're doing some learning, now you're going to pivot because you've learned something and you're going to experience something, and now you're going to continue going. I think the blessing of time, of a set aside delineated time where you are investing essentially these 4 months in the launching of your company is exactly what you're saying, because you are giving yourself that time, that runway, in order to build out your 30, 60, 90, 120 plus. You're building out your network, which is going to be impactful and meaningful for your company moving forward. You are building out relationships. Those take time, and they often will only really come to fruition in a meaningful way as you sort of get away from day one, if you will. So I think that there's a lot of the prep work, if you will, to get things aligned so that you have a meaningful plan moving forward. I think we talked about this last time, where the sort of founders forum, if you will, the band of brothers, the opportunity to connect with others who are going through this is the psychological, emotional other half of this, which is that most founders are going to figure out at some point that all of their best laid plans went awry, and they have to now rethink, and they have to redevelop, and they have to check their assumptions. And there are almost no better entities with whom to do that than other founders. You talk to your mentors, you should talk to your investors, of course, you should talk to everyone, but other founders who've gone through that process can help give the sort of green light, yellow light that you can still move forward, or wait, this is maybe something where you want to be a little bit more cautious. So I think that when companies leave, if you will, it's called an incubator for a reason, right? When they leave sort of this protected space where they have all this time to really focus on their growth moving forward, that's where the relationships become much more important, where the network becomes much more important as they continue to grow and develop.
Wait, I need to double down on that. I think you just dropped a little bomb there that I think is so important to really talk about. And I'm sure this is an entire new podcast that we can do together. And the transition, and is it the transition, but I guess maybe the distinction between the muscle called relationships and the muscle called getting work done, and how the culture of getting behind the desk and just getting stuff done versus getting out from the desk and having a Rolodex to call. Do you find that the best founders do that in a dynamic way, or do you find that there's a certain graduation period where founders want to stand behind their screens and they have to come out from within it and say, I'm never going to get there doing what I'm doing unless I'm willing to come out from behind the screen and meet some people?
I think that founders have to get out behind the screen. They have to be out there. I think what we tend to see in Israel, I think this is a historic truth. I'm not sure that it's as pertinent 100% now, but where Israeli founders tended to be much more comfortable with technology, they tended to be much more of a developer founder, if you will. And so the comfortable place was in a dark room coding, in a dark room solving, and not being out there. And I think this is one of the most critical things that entrepreneurs need to be doing. If you are not out there talking to potential customers, building those relationships before you have a whole lot to talk about, if you will, then you will invariably get there too late. You won't be able to get the feedback, you won't be able to get the support, and relationships take time. I mean, it just does. In order to build trust with somebody, there's just mileage that you have to be able to do. And I think that's, when I translate, or when I try to translate US, Israel, what's different here? How do things go? Israelis working in Israel can sometimes be given I don't want to say it's the benefit of the doubt, but there's a shorthand that gets developed when you are amongst very like people. And that shorthand is really exciting because it lets you do things much more quickly. But it is a false temptation because that shorthand doesn't exist in other places. And you are not working that muscle of how to build relationships. How do you network properly? It's not just for to have somebody to talk to during the conference, but how do you actually take that 5-minute interaction by the water cooler and then translate that into meaningful meetings where you now have a sounding board, or you have a person who's going to connect you to the next potential customer or client. And that's a muscle that just needs to be exercised. There are very few of us who are born comfortable doing it, but it just needs to be exercised. And I think that that's one of the elements that all founders need to do. Get out of the comfort place, get out of the room, talk to people who disagree with you, who see things differently, because it might either disconfirm some of the assumptions that you're making, or frankly make you hold more strongly those beliefs, but you'll have done it because you've actually gone through the rigorous examination and not just because that's your gut.
Very good.
Okay, you've teed up several things you need in a particular area that I would like to go a little bit more deeply into, and that is Startup Nation versus Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Essentially, the differences between the cultures in the two places, the differences between startup life. You referred to in Israel, everything is always pivoting. You just were talking now about the shorthand among those similar to you, a variety of things that would lead to some of the differences. So if you can think about, say, an American transplanting herself to Israel, you had to do it at one
faraway
time.
thought. Yes, I'll see if I can exercise the theater muscles to get to know that.
So what would you be warning them about coming in that direction from the States to Israel? Biggest difference to be ready for? And then the Israelis that you see trying to make the transatlantic leap into the US, which a lot of the MassChallenge companies are doing exactly that. What would be the biggest caution that you would offer them to make sure to be cognizant of?
So I think I think there are a couple of elements that are, and there is no value judgment, I think, on any of this. It's really, there are great things about both, and it's just to be sort of aware of how to. I referenced the shorthand here in Israel, and it's not just the fact that one can literally speak in shorthand and get across the message, but rather that there is this sense that everyone knows one another and there's easy access to one another. There are some wonderful things about that. I told in sort of my telling how I found myself here, the fact that I could literally email people who did not know me and who were central to this ecosystem, and they would make time to meet me and then give advice and share on and introduce me further is bananas. I mean, I can't imagine in New York, if I were moving to New York, that I would just email top investors in VCs, and they would make time to meet a stranger who was coming in without sort of a warm intro and the like. And that's something that I see over and over and over in Israel, this willingness to meet, this willingness to, volunteer time, to connect, to mentor, to talk. And it is a beautiful and wonderful thing. However, the flip side of that is if you're somehow not either able to connect or already connected into that community, it can feel incredibly difficult to do so. I mean, it's sort of like it can almost feel in group, out group, and because you see sort of this hyper connectivity and you see these really deep relationships that that really help things move along very quickly, and they are that shorthand. But if you're not there, then it feels really, really far away. And I think when we think about the local ecosystem and we recognize who's not been traditionally involved in the Israeli startup successes, if you will, part of it is because this feeling that that's somebody else, and they're super connected and they're super engaged with one another. So there isn't really an entree point in other places. So I think that for somebody who is coming into Israel and looking to build a new career or to make their place in Israel, it's be audacious enough to go reach out and to anybody who you want to, because you will find more open doors than you think from your perhaps previous ecosystem. Recognize that there are some deep relationships that already exist, and so you're coming into a game that's already being played, and so you have to figure out sort of how to make your mark and how to be unique and special there. And I think the other piece of it is the directness. I think we all talk about sort of how direct Israelis are. It's building out the skin that is thick enough to deal with that, because you may find you'll get real answers, but they may not be the ones that you want, and sort of being able to understand that level of communication and to sort of be okay with it. I think for Israelis coming to the States, there's first sort of the level of, just because you speak English doesn't mean you speak American, and it's the subcurrent, or it's the undertone of language that really matters, and whether that has to do with what literal language you're using and it's understanding sort of what the priorities of different entities are in the US. They're not the same as you might see here in Israel. There's obviously a whole lot going on in the world today, particularly around in the tech space, around diversity, around inclusion, around language, around products. And that is really nascent here. And if you aren't adept enough at understanding what are those cultural themes that are at play in other places, you're going to miss the boat, or you'll come off as being sort of not in the right place at the right time. And I think that's something that we as an ecosystem need to make sure we're aware of where our blind spots might be, so that we can really prepare our companies best to integrate there. So one has to do with really recognizing what are the other cultural manifestations that are happening in a different ecosystem. I think there's a language component that Israelis need to be aware of. What Americans say and what they mean may not be exactly the same word for word translation. I think the other piece is that there is, people make fun of it here, but sort of the process and the policies and these they seem like obstacles, these things that slow down your movement in the US are actually really important parts of what it is to do business in the US. And I think that that's a sort of I don't know if it's a misunderstanding or a lack of balance that I think here a lot of entrepreneurs and executives need to work through to really partner successfully in the US and to really grow successfully in the US.
I think it's critical. I think whoever's listening, this interview and both of this episode and the previous episode is absolutely critical for their success. I mean, the nuggets you've been sharing has been really incredible. I think in hearing the last thing that you said, it almost reminds me of, I forgot where I saw this quote once about how you can never win a gold medal without a gold medal coach. Like in the world of professional success, sports and whatever, in the areas of just high levels of personal competition, unless someone's helping you through it and unless you're doing things that may be counterintuitive, you're really not achieving the highest level of success. And I'm hearing you speak and saying to myself, you're right, but it's how do people know it? Meaning, yes, there are things that will feel natural to you that are not natural into the environment that you're in, because the environment you grew up in, or in really truth, the environment that you feel more your natural tendency towards is where you're going to go to. So like you said, those engineer types that really, saw enough movies about Mark Zuckerberg and want to hold themselves up into some, room with Red Bull, and that's going to get them to have their success. They don't know what you're talking about when you say, well, we got to get out there, right? And the people that every ecosystem and every environment and every stage really requires a different level of work. And to your point, which I really want to make sure gets hammered home, is that if you're out there as a founder or an executive and you're hitting walls, it could be because you're playing the wrong game. It could be that you're exercising muscles that don't need to be exercised now. Like you're playing with your right hand when you should be building up your left hand. And I think it's so critical for people to understand before they could solve it, but to understand that challenge.
Well, I think, Charlie, it references so much what Dean Wasserman was saying, which is that this is a team sport, right? Like Innovation isn't a solo game, and it's not a solo game, not because there aren't brilliant minds out there. There are, but no one can do all of this, and no one is going to be right for every role. And this really is a team sport, and it's not just the people who are playing, it's the bench, right? Have you built out your bench of supporters of I don't know, the kitchen cabinet, the people that you can call and get real advice from, who can sort of boil things down for you? Have you found those people that are part of your story? And I think that that's the founders that I've met who are doing really amazing things and are able to do the whole long slog, the marathon that it is to build meaningful, substantive, large companies in this day and age, are not only those who are incredibly passionate and want to solve a major problem that they've identified. They're not only those who have the leadership skills to bring others with them and the humility to learn from everyone around them. They're also those who recognize and know that they can't be everything at all times.
Right.
And so whether that's they need to hire people who are going to be with them, they need to consult with people, they need to bring into their orbit folks who think differently and who they can trust. Those are the founders that I get super excited about, because they're the ones, to me, who are best prepared to lead this team into the next phase, the next major company. And that, I think, for me, as someone who's now sitting in Israel, what's exciting to see is that we're building real large companies that are going to solve things for decades to come. This isn't just a technology play. It's about building meaningful companies that are taking on serious challenges, that are impacting the world. And that's being part of that evolution is just so exciting.
Being able to have Startup Nation also become Scale Nation, which was
Yeah.
a long time the knock against Israeli companies, that they get to a certain size, sell out, that they can't go beyond that. And now through your incubating, through educators who can bring knowledge to them, fortunately, we're able to see that we're arming them to be able to do a lot more of the building, a lot more of the scaling, and a lot more of the high impact, whether it's on just the Israeli side or on the transatlantic bridge that they're able to build to the US.
Right. Right.
Well, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your wisdom. This has really been incredible. Tons of insights. If people want to find out more or any way to hear you again, or how do they follow you? How do they gain from your wisdom?
I am around on LinkedIn. I'm happy to talk to whoever, with whomever I can advise or help or support, and would be happy to do so.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Dean, final thoughts before we close?
No, I think that Yonit had a golden last couple of minutes that pulls together lots of the things that we've had throughout the 3 seasons about the need to be able to bring together product and financing and people, and the people side of both the self-awareness and also the interpersonal. And so in Hebrew, the critical way in which the Ben Adam La'atzmo underlies the Ben Adam La'Chavero, and the criticality of appreciating that as a founder, and the role that mentors, educators, incubator leaders are able to play, tap them, bring them all together, and be able to have all the pieces of stacking the deck in your favor as you try to go and change the world, have all of that culminate in being able to maximize your impact.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And for those that are joining us, thanks for joining us. You can always email us questions at foundersdilemmaspodcast@gmail.com, and we look forward to seeing you next time.